actually don't study Brazil. But I do know something about corruption. And I know something about the only other instance in which a large number of politicians have been driven from office by judicial inquiries, the Italian case of Manipulite. And so I will make some, I will draw some of my remarks from research that I've done on Italy. So does the rule of law reduce wrongdoing by politicians? To get to the answer, yes, it does, but not by locking them up, not in the ways that you think. So that's what I will be talking about, and I've already been given permission to go a little over. Usually I go under, so we'll see where I end up. This scatter plot is what I want to begin with. I realize it's hard to see, so I'll tell you what it is. The dots are countries, okay? This axis is the Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index, where higher values mean countries are less corrupt. That's just how they make their index up. And this is log GDP per capita. So this simply shows that as countries get richer, they become less corrupt according to global perceptions of corruption. That's a very well-known fact. The countries that you can see are coded two colors, blue and red, and the coding is from the World Justice Project's Rule of Law Index, and I've simply divided it into half, where some countries are better on rule of law and some are worse on rule of law. You can guess which is which, I think. The blue countries are better in rule of law, and the red countries are worse in rule of law. So I imagine you want to know where Brazil is, and I realize that I don't know. I'll have to look when I can see better. So the thing that comes out in this graph is that the poor countries that are also judged to be the corrupt countries are also the countries with bad rule of law. The rich countries that are judged to be the less corrupt countries are the countries that have better rule of law. So we know the rule of law improves with economic development. We know that corruption falls with economic development. It's impossible to know whether that relationship is causal or what causes what or sort of what's happening there. We can only make these observations that rich countries have good rule of law and are less corrupt. Keep in mind that rich countries did used to be poor, and so they probably used to be corrupt and they used to have bad rule of law. I do want to comment as well that it's hard to know what the data is measuring. The Corruption Perceptions Index has all kinds of deficiencies, and I think Alberto has already talked about, I think it was Alberto who talked about the weaknesses in the World Justice Project's Rule of Law Index that Eric also used in his presentation. So I think it's kind of the best of these indexes that are out there, but it is not unproblematic. Nonetheless, the patterns are so striking overall that that's where I want to begin. So what I want to begin with is the fact that at that level, we can't tell what's going on causally. So does the rule of law keep malfeasant politicians out of public office? I'm going to pull this all together, don't worry. No, it doesn't, because typically, when a politician is accused of some kind of wrongdoing, including corruption, that politician is reelected. And that is true in every country in the world and for which we have data. When politicians who are accused of anything from corruption to molesting underage girls runs again, they get reelected. Greater than 50% probability. Sorry to break the news to you. So what I want to argue is that voters are not very good at holding politicians accountable, but the rule of law changes the incentives of politicians and of political parties, and that ultimately elites can check other elites. Voters aren't very good at controlling elites. The rule of law, even at its best, does not punish many malfeasant politicians. Locking them up is not actually necessary for the rule of law to be an effective check on a lot of forms of malfeasance. So most of the effect of the rule of law is via second order impacts, meaning indirect spillover effects. So it's not that the rule of law directly takes criminal politicians or corrupt politicians and throws them in jail. As I will try to document for you, the rule of law scares elites from renominating malfeasant politicians. So how can we get a handle on the problem? If we use the cross-national data, we really cannot identify causality well. So what I suggest is that we should study situations that change within a country rather rapidly from low enforcement to high enforcement, where the rule of law was sort of not operative and then suddenly kicks in, which is, I believe, what's going on in Brazil now, but also what went on in Italy in the 90s in the period of what's called mani pulite, the clean hands operation. Manuel, in his talk in panel 4, is going to give you some information, some evidence from Brazil about what happens when you change from low to high enforcement. So I'm going to leave all of Brazil to him. And I will illustrate this argument talking with data from Italy. So changing enforcement changes incentives. Manuel will illustrate in his study how changing enforcement can change the incentives of office holders so that people who might have been tempted to be corrupt are going to rein it in when they see their peers being indicted. Changing enforcement changes the incentives for the gatekeepers of those who are seeking office. In other words, the parties who nominate people to stand for office. Changing enforcement changes incentives of the people themselves who are seeking public office. And I'm going to illustrate this now with data from Italy. So this is data from a paper that I'm working on with a former student of mine, Rafael Ascher, who is Italian and who worked on this for his dissertation. So in Italy, we have two periods recently of corruption scandals. We have the period in the early 90s, which is the period called mani pulite, with a clean hands operation, when in 92 and 93, a third of the members of the House of Parliament were charged with wrongdoing, and many former prime ministers were charged, and many local politicians were charged, and the whole system was sort of under indictment, and the party system fell apart as a result. There was a second period in the period of about 2008 to 2013, so really in around 2012, when corruption scandals uncovered wrongdoing on the part of a much smaller number of government officials. This was under Berlusconi. But a bunch of other people were investigated in that period, and the scandal was also very much in the news at the time. So what we're looking at here are the proportion of members of parliament of the lower house, who in Italy are called deputies, who get reelected according to whether they were under investigation for corruption or not in the period just prior to the scandal, and then the period of the scandal and the next election. We don't know whether these people are corrupt or not. We only know that they were investigated and some of them were charged. Most of them were not even charged, and as far as I know, nobody was ever locked up in Italy. Nobody went to jail for anything. So that's not what's going on here. So in the period of Manipulite, in the 10th legislature, which was just prior to the scandal, you can see that there were actually still a lot of politicians who, even in that period, were investigated for corruption. And you can see that they tended to get reelected at rates that were about the same as the rates of the people who were not investigated for corruption. In the period just before the second set of scandals that we look at, you can see that those who were looked at for corruption were reelected at even higher rates than those who were not looked at for corruption. So apparently, before there's a lot of publicity about corruption, voters don't discriminate between corrupt and non-corrupt politicians. Once there's a scandal, once it's in the news, voters may decide to punish. So after Manipulite, those politicians who ran again, who had been investigated for corruption, really did fail to get reelected. They lost office. That happens much less so in the later period. So voters might react, but they don't react uniformly, and they don't react very well. They don't just drive the corrupt out of office. Why not? Because they have other priorities, like which party they prefer, for instance. So how then can revelations of corruption drive people out of office if the voters don't do it? So what this data shows is that it's really it's other political elites who can keep the corrupt out of office. Because what happens in both of these periods is that the people who are charged with corruption, once it becomes public that there's a scandal and a lot of people have been doing a lot of bad things, stealing a lot of money from the public, the people who are charged with corruption or investigated for corruption fail to get renominated by their parties. And they all want to. I think we can all assume that politicians who are stealing money while in office would love to stay in office and keep stealing. So they're not voluntarily giving up their ability to embezzle funds, for instance, or demand kickbacks. They are seeking renomination, and their parties are not giving it to them. These are the rates of renomination of the same groups of politicians in the same two sets of legislative periods. Both scandals had the same impact. Before the scandal, parties would renominate corrupt politicians at rates that were the same as politicians who were not investigated for corruption. As once it gets into the press and there's a big scandal, the parties step in, they act as gatekeepers, and they do not list those people on the ticket. Note that in these two periods, there are different electoral systems in place. This is open list PR, and this is this kind of weird mixed system that Italy decided to use in that period. So these are completely different electoral systems. So the electoral system may be somewhat relevant, but it's clearly not the most relevant thing that's going on here at all. So the parties are playing a very big role. What happens then to the re-election rates of those who are renominated? So now we're looking at just the people who get renominated and whether they then get reelected. And here you can really see that if you're renominated, it's only after manipulite that you get punished by the voters. And in this period, in the more recent scandal, the voters will, how shall I put it? They re-elect whoever the parties give them. You know, it's the parties who are picking who the candidates are, and the voters are not discriminating once the candidate is on the list, using the information that they have about corruption, information that they've received from the press. So voters do not consistently keep the malfeasant out of office. You cannot trust the public to check bad politicians. They're not good at it. They have other priorities, like trying to support their party because of programmatic commitments. Judicial enforcement, even when it's only investigations, not convictions, but judicial enforcement of any type changes the incentives of other elites, in this case of the parties. Here we can see that these are sort of the data that underlie the figures I've just shown you. So in the period of manipulite, there were 162 members of the lower house who were investigated in the 11th legislature. That is manipulite, that is the clean hands operation. That's when all the people were investigated. And only 18% of those were renominated. In the prior period, 39 legislators were investigated, 92% of them got renominated. So it's only when it becomes a big issue in the press that the gatekeeping capacity of the parties begins to have bite. Parties don't react until it's public. Then they react and they don't renominate. Same thing happened in this later period when there are far fewer people who are investigated. Once the investigations become public in the 16th legislature, you can see that the rate of renomination of those who are investigated just falls catastrophically. So in his dissertation, Raphael shows that really this is a fabulous research design, because he shows that those specific individuals with more negative media mentions are the ones who are least likely to be renominated. So we really can see this coincidence of institutions. We see the judiciary investigating and the press publicizing, and then the party elite saying, whoops, okay, these people, we cannot let them run again. We have to rein it in. Presumably at some level they're afraid of the public, they're afraid of the voters, they're afraid of their reputation, even though the voters aren't very good at punishing corrupt politicians. They're afraid, let's say, of the longer-term reputational effects. They're afraid, perhaps, that if they let this go, they will inspire the judiciary to actually lock them up. They're afraid of reactions by other elites. So, but it's not a simple problem of the judiciary indicts people and throws them in jail and the rule of law works. You need multiple branches of government and non-government, like party elites, to operate together in order to change the norms. So I do want to say something that I think is very controversial. Maybe you'll ask me about this, which is, I think that the Clean Hands investigation led to a permanent reduction of political corruption in Italy. And I think that that there is evidence of that. But I know it's very controversial because the leading Italian scholars who study corruption, who have a vested interest in thinking that corruption is everywhere, continue to argue that corruption is everywhere. I don't think that the kind of data they use is very convincing of that. So when we look here, we can see that with clean hands, when the Clean Hands investigation went into effect, the corrupt were not renominated. Those people who were investigated for clean hand under the Clean Hands never re-entered political life. One of them made it back into Parliament, and that was all over the newspapers. And then everybody thought that that Manipulite had failed, and in fact, that was the only person. The rest of them were out of politics basically forever. And then you can see that in the later period, the number investigated in Parliament for later scandals regarding some, relatively similar kinds of charges, that it's far, far fewer in number. So I realize this is very controversial, but I think that the data that we look at supports this interpretation. Okay, does the rule of law reduce wrongdoing by politicians? Yes. Most of the effect is second order. Nobody was convicted here. The rule of law is more effective indirectly than directly. Investigating some politicians reduces corruption by others, and publicizing corruption is very important because it causes the corrupt to be deselected by party elites. Investigating and publicizing corruption may cause voters to switch partisan support. And it's not that the public is unimportant, but they're not the first mover, and they're not by any means the most important actor. Largely, the rule of law operates effectively when there's a culture in the political elite that supports the rule of law. Thank you.
This Nara Pavão, talking about corruption, horizontal accountability, and public opinion in Brazil.
Nara's going to make similar. I don't really want to sit here.
Thank you all for being here. It's a pleasure to get to present my work. There are many common themes in my presentation, regarding Miriam's presentation, so it's great to get to present after her. I'm actually presenting two lines of research that I have, and they're connected to the theme of the conference. So the first one is my research on the limits of electoral accountability for corruption, which is similar to, which points to results similar to the results that Miriam showed here. So basically trying to understand why voters don't punish corrupt politicians. And the second line of research, which is a newer research, is co-authored, and it talks about the potential of horizontal accountability for corruption. Basically, we're trying to understand if the judiciary can change corruption, not by arresting politicians and punishing politicians, but by changing people's expectations and attitudes, political attitudes. So basically, that's what this research is trying to do. I also have to say that I'm not presenting a lot of data here. I have a lot of data. I can share my papers with you, but it's just because it's a lot of content. I'm just going to present the main findings and the main intuitions behind the research, and I hope you trust me. I'm only presenting true stuff. So basically, corruption. We care about corruption because corruption undermines democratic representation. The idea here is that politicians are elected to represent voters and not their interests. And corruption signals exactly the opposite, that politicians are pursuing interests, like private interests, right? So it basically undermines democratic representation, but we also care a lot about corruption because it affects a lot of outcomes we tend to care about. The expectation of the democratic theory, it's a very positive one, right, is that elections will curb corruption. And the idea here is that by offering voters the chance to throw their rascals out, voters will actually punish politicians at the ballot box and will in turn increase the cost of corruption. So basically, politicians will refrain from corruption when they fear the possibility of electoral punishment. As Miriam said, there's actually limited evidence of that, right? So basically, some studies have documented the limited electoral punishment of corruption around the world. Here's Miriam's work in Italy. There's also similar work in Japan, United States, UK, France, Spain. And the main question is why accountability for corruption fails and corrupt politicians survive democratic elections. There are a few explanations for that, or a few theories, right, that tries to explain why this happens. The first one is the informational hypothesis, the idea that voters don't punish corruption because they don't know, they don't have information about corruption. There's also the trade-off hypothesis that Miriam also mentioned, that voters actually know about corruption, but and they care about corruption, but they care about other things more, and they're willing to trade corruption for other things about politicians' performance that they care more about. I'm sorry, I need to get some water. And there's a cynicism hypothesis, which is the hypothesis that I develop and test in my research. And their argument is that if voters perceive all politicians to be corrupt, they are unlikely to use corruption as a vote choice criteria and to throw the rascals out. So this is a theme that came up in earlier presentations too. And what I do is that I develop this argument relying on voting behavior theories. I use data from Brazil to kind of prove this argument, or I offer evidence in support of this argument. And basically, that was the general argument, but in more specific terms, this argument entails 3 steps, right, or 3 components. The first one is that corruption is actually different from other electoral issues. Voters have kind of lower expectations regarding politicians' capacity or willingness to fight corruption. And that's different when you talk about the economy, when you talk about outcomes of the system, voters tend to have higher expectations. But corruption is not an outcome. Corruption is a feature of the political process. So voters have really low expectations about what politicians can do about a process from which they benefit, and from a process that they are not going to have incentives to change. There's also this idea that the cynicism, so this idea that all politicians are corrupt, it obviously reduces voters' incentives to hold their government accountable for corruption. And finally, the cynical attitudes, unfortunately, they are the result of high levels of corruption. So to support this argument, I use data, focus group data from Brazil. I also use cross-country survey data showing that this is not an argument that is valid only for Brazil, but it holds cross-nationally. And also I use survey data from Brazil, both observational data and experimental data in support of this hypothesis. And my main findings, just to summarize, what I find in this research, is that corruption is actually different from other electoral issues. Is that when corruption is pervasive, voters perceive it as being a constant. So they're unlikely to take this as a criteria that will help them choose between politicians. And also this perceived lack of choice option to deal with corruption undermines accountability for this issue. And finally, that accountability for corruption will be weaker precisely when it's needed the most, so in highly corrupt countries. The main implications of these findings are really pessimistic, right? So the idea is that we need to rethink general theories of electoral accountability. I think these theories, they are really kind of inspired by economic voting. And as I said, corruption is a much more complex issue for voters. Also, it gives us really pessimistic lessons about elections, right? It shows, as Miriam said, elections are not really good at curbing corruption. But also, it also points to this characterization of corruption that I would like to call your attention to, which is now this understanding of corruption as a cyclical problem. And some authors have talked about how corruption is a trap, right? So countries get trapped in high levels of corruption. Some talk about corruption as being a vicious cycle, or as a self-fulfilling prophecy, or as a frequency-dependent equilibrium. or even, this idea that corruption corrupts. So the main theme across all these studies is that, the incidence of different types of corruption seems to depend on the frequency of corruption, so on existing levels of corruption. So it's really hard to break the cycle of corruption. So if voters perceive all politicians to be corrupt, they're not going to punish corruption, and corrupt politicians are going to continue doing, being corrupt. And then that's just a cycle that it's really hard to break. And that's, where the new research project, the new line of research comes from. So we're trying to understand how can we break this cycle of cynical attitudes toward corruption. We think judicial institutions can play a huge role in that. But the truth is that we actually don't know much about it because we don't have evidence of that yet. So some scholars have, kind of proposed this big bang approach to fighting corruption. The idea is that we need something to disrupt politics, and politics as usual, so corrupt politicians. Larry Diamond talks about, the best way to fight endemic corruption is not by, kind of using a technical fix, but we need revolutionary changes in institutions. And I think that's precisely what's going on in Brazil, and that's why we look at Brazil as our main case so far. And Justice Barroso yesterday talked about, how what's going on in Brazil is a change in a paradigm, right, of impunity. So we're trying to understand how this has changed public opinion, how this has affected public opinion, and if voters feel more confident and more empowered to fight corruption, less cynical, less tolerant, more enthusiastic about politics, or if the opposite, if the judicial activism against corruption, if it's emptying out politics. So the current project, it's currently entitled Fighting Corruption, Curbing Cynicism, Understanding the Effects of Anti-Corruption Judicial Activism in Latin America. It's co-authored with Ezequiel Gonzalez Ocantos, who's an associate professor at Oxford. And the research question is that what are the effects of anti-corruption judicial activism on mass attitudes toward corruption and towards politics? Specifically, we're trying to understand if judicial activism or judicial accountability curbs voters' tolerance for corruption and political cynicism, or if it actually fosters, fuels more cynicism and more tolerance for corruption. So the expectations of the literature are mixed. There's this idea that judicial investigations can either purify democracy or it can discredit democracy. So we basically have this debate between optimists and pessimists, right, about the effects of anti-corruption judicial activism. And just, a simple characterization of this debate could be the following. For optimists, anti-corruption judicial activism, just, it's this display of institutional virtuosity, right? The idea that the system itself can generate the solution for its main problem, right, for corruption. And this would disrupt cynical beliefs about politics because it would make voters, it would signal to voters that they don't have to accept corruption, that corruption is not the only game in town. And the outcome would be that this would disrupt cultures of impunity. For pessimists, the idea is that anti-corruption judicial activism, it could even be positive, but what it's doing in practice, it's revealing a lot of negative information about the system. It's just bringing up a lot of, negative information about politicians. So we need to understand how this affects public opinion. And the idea is that this would crash people's hope in the system and just reinforcing cynical beliefs about politics and, lower expectations about politics and higher tolerance toward corruption. And the idea is that we don't think that, it's just one outcome or the other is true. We're actually trying to understand the conditions under which we should observe, the positive outcome or the negative outcome. And our plan, we've applied for, funding to conduct this research for a few years. But in the short term, we've fielded 2 survey experiments in Brazil and 1 in Peru, trying to understand the consequences of this, what we call this anti-corruption judicial activism. So the empirical strategies that we've conducted 2 vignette experiments in Brazil. I don't have time to go over all the data and to present everything, so I'm just going to present the main intuitions and the main findings behind them. And we focus on corruption scandals just because we think that that's how people learn the most about corruption. It's in the form of corruption scandals. So in the actual manipulation, we talk about a corruption scandal. And in the first pilot, which was fielded in August of 2017, we manipulate the source of accountability efforts. So we actually manipulate the triggers of this, who triggers this scandal. And in the second pilot, we actually manipulate some features of the judicial activism that we think are going to, have an impact on public opinion and decide whether we're going to have a negative outcome or a positive outcome. And both surveys were nationally representative with 1,200 respondents and face-to-face interviews. So the outcomes we care about is we're looking at emotions, how people feel about politics and how they feel in general. So we're looking at, we follow the literature on emotions in politics, and we look at hope, enthusiasm. We also look at worry and anxiety, which are, the literature makes a big distinction between those two emotions. And we look at attitudes toward corruption, so cynicism and tolerance. We also look at leadership preferences, so we're looking at populist tendencies or tendencies to support outsiders. Just to give you an idea, so this is a question that asks, now who do you think would do a better job running the country? The first option is a traditional politician from a traditional party. The second option is an outsider, somebody outside of politics that knows and is willing to govern with traditional politicians. And the third option is somebody outside of politics that combats traditional politicians. And 60% of Brazilians chose that third option. And we also look at protests against corruption. So the willingness to protest or to engage in protests against corruption. So just to give us a sense of how mobilized people are against corruption. In the first pilot, we manipulate the source of accountability efforts, as I said. We think courts are different in terms of the language they use, right? There's this idea of myth of legality. And the idea is that it would produce a credibility boost, and judicial institutions should indeed be a credible source of accountability. And the idea is that it would convince voters that, that the system has its, ways of combating corruption. And this would just convince people that it makes sense to not accept corruption. It makes sense to want to change the system. So just the design of the first experiment, we manipulate who triggered the JBS scandal. We looked at that specific scandal. We portrayed it as being triggered by the judiciary as part of Lava Jato, but we also present it as being triggered by JBS, who is being investigated for paying bribes. The expectation is that scandals triggered by the judiciary should reduce voters' cynical beliefs and should reduce tolerance toward corruption. And just to give you a sense of how we presented this information, this is the control. Everybody gets that first part. It's just talking briefly about the corruption scandal. In the first treatment, we say that the scandal was triggered by information revealed by the judiciary as part of Lava Jato, a large anti-corruption investigation. And we also, in the second treatment, so they received the control, and they also received this information that the scandal was triggered by JBS. And the main findings, again, I'm not presenting any table here, I'm just summarizing the results, is that those exposed to the judiciary treatment, they tend to reject more, they are more likely to reject traditional parties and to embrace populists. And these effects are stronger among those who trust the judiciary the most. So they are more willing to protest and even more willing to support populists. So the idea we have a very strong heterogeneous effect across trust in the judiciary, which is what we would expect. Is this a sign of growing cynicism? We don't know. It could be just a sign of people wanting to change the system, using outside resources, right? They don't think that they can change the system through, by just keep electing the same politicians. But it's unclear. Again, these are just, two first pilots that we've conducted in Brazil, so the findings are not very conclusive. And the second pilot, we manipulate, can I take like 2 minutes, 3 minutes just to finish? So we manipulate two positive attributes of judicial process, of judicial investigations that we think are key for the effects of these investigations, for the effects that this investigation should have on public opinion. So we manipulate perceptions of the efficiency of Lava Jato in terms of delivering results, punishments, and we even talk about money that is being recovered. And we also manipulate perceptions of procedural fairness, because we know that when people evaluate the judiciary, they're not only looking at outcomes, but they're also looking at judicial behavior, about, how the judiciary is behaving. So that's why we look at these two features, because for the literature, these are two key features. And again, the experiment is really similar to the first one. So we just give this general information about this massive scandal. And here in the first treatment, everybody receives this control, but the second group receives the control plus the treatment, indicating all this, the effectiveness of Lava Jato so far, right? In terms of it has led to 165 convictions, and it has helped, recover 4 billion reais that were deviated from public coffers. And we also manipulate perceptions of procedural fairness. So we say that this is all true information, okay? We're not presenting false information. The idea here is that the judiciary the practices of the judiciary has been recognized as fair and as legit. And the idea is that these two features should be driving people's reactions to Lava Jato. And the main finding is that both effectiveness and impartiality have positive effects. So they increase hope and they reduce worry. We didn't find any effects of the previous treatment, the previous experiment on emotions, but we did find on this one. So basically the judiciary, when it's perceived as being effective or impartial, it has the power to increase people's hope in the system. Information about impartiality of the judiciary reduced support for traditional parties and increased support for outsiders and populists. Again, this seems to be a pattern across the two experiments. And we didn't find any significant effects on attitudes toward corruption. But we also find really strong heterogeneous effects across levels of education. Basically what we find is that most of the movement that is going on with this experiment is going on among those who are more educated, right? So basically the idea is that highly educated individuals, they become more hopeful, enthusiastic, and optimistic, and less worried or cynical as a result of perceived judicial impartiality. Also, they become more likely to embrace anti-system candidates as a result of being exposed to this treatment. And no such effect is observed for other educational groups. So basically, this has to do with the capacity to understand what's going on, probably, or perhaps with higher trust in the judiciary among those groups. So just two final considerations. The first one is that we understand that Lava Jato is going to have really long-term effects. We wish we could get a 40-year-long research funding to continue this research until Lava Jato actually is concluded. But basically, we understand that the dynamics might change over time. And we also, one thing that we are trying to do is to unpack judicial institutions, because I think they're different, and we do want in future experiments and in our future research in general to separate those things and try to understand exactly, which specific institutions have a larger power or more power in changing people's expectations and attitudes toward politics. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now, Beatriz Magaloni talking about the experience of Mexico with the war drugs.
Thank you so much for being here and for listening to our presentation. So this is joint work with Alberto, Gustavo, Ayla, and Vidal. We've been working on the question of criminal violence and corruption in Mexico for a long time. I have also been working in Brazil, and I'm not going to be talking about that today, but more about Mexico. And so before I present this work, the presentation was a long one, so I'll try to put it in 15 minutes, which is going to be challenging. So I try not to put a lot of data, but there is some data here. But before I begin the presentation, I just want to motivate it by a general concern about what is going on in Mexico. For those of you who know a little bit about the country, we had a transition to democracy in 2000 when the PRI, which was the party in power for 70 years, was first defeated. And so in a paradoxical way, things have turned really sour for Mexico after the transition. So we have more human rights violations than we used to have during the authoritarian era, more practice of torture by the police and the military. We have more violence and possibly also more corruption. Here I'm talking about the type of corruption by governments that facilitate this type of violence. I'm not talking about corruption, I'm not measuring corruption as grabbing money illegally, but obviously it is driven by that. A lot of it is driven by greed and the association between the politicians, between police, and between local, especially local governments and criminal organizations. So the research questions, this is the outline of the presentation. I'm not going to Okay, so two main questions motivate this presentation. So the first is, we want to understand the conditions under which drug cartels perform their illegal operations without targeting the community. So in Mexico, we used to have a lot of drug trafficking happening, but the community barely noticed it. There was a lot of corruption at the national level. Communities even believed that the president negotiated the country with a group of 4 cartels, and that the country was well divided. There was very little violence. There was a lot of drug trafficking going on, but the population barely noticed it. And all of a sudden, we now observe cartels increasingly turning more against the population. We see issues like extortion that affect a lot small businesses in particular. So you have to pay to the cartels to run your business, and if you don't do that, they kill you and your family. And we also start increasingly to observe more issues like sexual violence, human trafficking, and really nasty behavior on the part of the cartels towards the community. We want to understand why that change happens, why cartels behave so differently. And we also want to understand why cartels, under some conditions, co-opt the community and really offer collective benefits to the community in the form of, one of them is conflict resolution. Gambetta very clearly described this in his study of the Sicilian Mafia. But we also observe many cases where cartels offer money to buy houses or loans, to afford medical emergencies, etc. So we really want to understand this cooptation versus coercion strategies by the cartels. And I here bring some examples, but I have to be short on this. But this is one quote from a man in Sinaloa saying, "Here the narcos are careful with the community. They even have food stores where you can buy everything much cheaper." Can you believe it? Last time the Chapo, he was finally put in prison and extradited, was on the run. Some people told me that they knew of people who helped him hide, even hosting him in their home. So this is a quote that tells that the cartel was quite embedded in the community, and that in many instances, communities there didn't really fear the narcos that much. And these are 2 examples of extortion. One quote is from Michoacan, saying, "Well, drug traffickers here come to collect money from us. We need to pay because if we don't, they kill you and your family. The police does nothing because they are working together, collecting money for the cartels." And then this is another example that came out recently in a magazine called El Proceso, that has very good coverage of violence in Mexico. And it's a very disturbing long article about Los Zetas and how they are virtually running killing fields. That's the way I can describe it. And this is being run from the prison El Cerezo in Piedras Negras in Coahuila. And what they literally describe is that they bring to the prison hundreds of bodies of their victims, and then they incinerate them in the prison. So they disappear them, and the bodies are of women, men, children, so members of the community. And in many of these cases, it's either because they refuse to pay the money to run their businesses, the extortion, el derecho de piso, or whatever reason they get in conflict with the cartels. So to measure this, obviously, is very difficult. It's very difficult to conduct this type of work. We have been doing this type of work both in Brazil and in Mexico, and there are very many ways in which you can do this. One is to make good partnerships with local organizations that work on the ground. And in this case, we don't do that, but we've done a lot of that in Mexico and Brazil. Here, what we did is run a survey experiment using list experiments that try to go around the issue of fear, because obviously if you ask these questions, do you pay money to the cartels and they don't trust you, they're not going to answer truthfully. So these experiments try to go around the issue of fear, social desirability, and so on. So I'll talk more about how much we gain from these experiments versus using victimization surveys. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the background in Mexico in terms of violence. Between 2006 and 2015, there were more than 180,000 people murdered in the country. According to official figures, 30,000 people have disappeared, and this is the ones that we know, the ones that are registered. But obviously the figure must be much larger. And recently, Mexican authorities have uncovered more than 200 mass graves all over the country, containing more than 600 bodies. And these mass graves continue to appear around the country. So the situation is, it's very disturbing. It's beyond violence. It's just the type of violence that is being used increasingly. And this is just to describe, this is not murder rate, but just counts. And as you can see, there is a sharp increase in violence in 2007. The dark part reflects the best estimations we have of murders that happen between drug cartels fighting each other. And then the gray area is murders that affect the general population. So there is a very sharp increase in 2007, and that increase coincides with so this is how it was in 2007. And this is how it looks in 2011. I'm stopping here in 11 because that's where we collected the survey. But the country is increasingly going more violent in all this region, which is the area where Mexico produces poppies for heroin. And as you know, the US is experiencing one of the most severe health crises in many, many decades that relate to heroin consumption. So that is really feeding a lot of the violence here. But this data that we are collecting is 2011. We have also calculated all the turf wars that happen among cartels. This comes from a PhD dissertation by Gustavo Robles. And just to, so turf wars are defined as unusual increases in violence that happen in different communities. And the size of the circles tell you how many people are dying. So just to tell you where cartels fighting is in areas suitable for cultivation of drugs, as I just described, the area for the production of poppies. Areas near the transportation network, so ports. In the south of the country, a lot of the cocaine coming from South America arrives there, and also the chemicals necessary to produce methamphetamine. So that explains the violence in some of the ports in the south and in the west area of the country. And obviously, they are also fighting for control of valuable drug trafficking routes that bring the drugs to the U.S. So that's why the violence is very intense in the north of the country. So one of the reasons why the drug you see this sharp increase in violence in 2007 is that the former president of Mexico, Felipe Calderon, decided to start a drug war. And basically what he said is, I'm going to send the army to find the cartels. So it's the first time we see the army deployed in so many states in Mexico, and they virtually have become law enforcers in the country. Second, they continue to do drug seizures, burning marijuana and poppy crop production and so on, as other presidents did. But a very different strategy that this president followed was that he decided to attack the cartels in their organization by arresting the leaders of them. So this is the operations. 9 states had the presence of the army, and this is the list that actually he released at the beginning of his administration. The colors reflect the different cartels, and then the pictures obviously are the main drug leaders, and they arrested or killed all of these leaders during the administration. We did actually the government approached us to analyze the impact of these strategies, and we did a very long study. We were able to demonstrate that this strategy unfortunately dispersed violence in Mexico for 3 reasons. One was that when you arrest the leader of the cartel, there are fights among the cartels as to whom is going to replace the leader. Second is that when a cartel loses his leader, they become weaker, and other organizations find that as an opportunity to attack the territory. And the third, which is really what worries us the most, has to do with the way the cartels relate to the population. So normally drug cartels and the leaders have certain interest in controlling the behavior of the criminal cells. And when they remove the leaders, the criminal cells really become in a way loose and start preying on the population. And this is really what we have observed, a metamorphosis of the criminal groups in Mexico. We have, on the one hand, more and more criminal groups operating. Now the government counted 17 cartels and all the criminal gangs operating. Then criminal groups have turned to other lines of business. As I mentioned, it used to be drug trafficking, now it's extortion and some other activities. And increasingly they are targeting, and this is what the area of corruption comes, they are targeting local governments. They are really trying to capture local governments because to perform all these illegal operations, they need the cooperation of law enforcement agents, especially if you want to turn against the population, do all these crimes. Local police and the local prosecutors are in charge of these crimes. So increasingly we see more and more local governments working in association with the cartels, so that this is really what I describe as a form of criminal governance or a form of mafia state really operating in many parts of Mexico. So just because I have very little time, I'm going to skip the literature, but basically we have 5 hypotheses that we want to evaluate. We draw from the Civil War literature and also from literature on drug trafficking violence with regards to these activities or strategies cartels use towards the community. So our first hypothesis is that where you have higher levels of contestation among cartels, you are going to have more extortion. And I can go all over why this is the case. When you have monopoly control, so only one cartel is in control of a territory, we expect to have more benign behavior towards the community. This type of behavior I noticed of the Chapo running sort of selling food cheap for the community or even giving money in credit and so on. We also have some expectations with regard to how criminal groups are organized. So more hierarchical criminal groups that have leadership stability would have, in according to our hypothesis, more benign behavior towards the community. And the last part, which deals more with the theme of the conference, has to do with collusion or capture by the state. Capture of the state by criminal groups. And here, part is very hard to measure. We are doing all sorts of different analysis with victimization surveys to really try to tackle the question of police corruption and the capture of criminal organizations of local police. But here we are going to have a very simple hypothesis that relates to which party controls the local office. And for reasons that I don't have time to explain, the PRI has been traditionally characterized by being a party that is very tolerant with criminal groups and also has profited a lot from that association with criminal groups. The PAN, as I mentioned, began this drug war, and actually the sort of mandate of the president, although it didn't produce the desired results, was to really fight drug cartels and try to break those associations. So with the use of this list experiment, I'm going to run because I don't have time. I don't know how much time. 2 minutes. Okay, so we, just to give you an example of what a list experiment looks like, for those of you who haven't seen it, many of you must have. But the idea is to add a series of items that are not really very controversial. So, for example, in this case, we asked, please tell me of the following activities which you have done. I got drunk at a party I went to. I did some exercise outdoors. I attended church. I attend church almost every Sunday. And then the treatment group receives this additional item that says, I have given money to drug or criminal organizations so that they do not harm me. Okay, and so all that, you have two groups and one randomly assigned. The group receives this treatment. And really the difference in the average response between one group and the other tells you the extent to which there is, in this case, extortion by criminal organizations. So we did, I'm sorry you cannot read this, but we did 4 experiments, one that had to do with extortion, as I just mentioned, the other with help. So the conditions under which you ask help for criminal organizations, and then also police corruption. And the last one, whether they are observing convoys of armed men that do not belong to the army or the police. Obviously, these are criminals. And in Mexico, everybody knows how they look. They come in the big SUVs with guns and so on. So we just wanted to ask how present these organizations are in Mexico. And so just to give, please don't read the numbers, but just on average, 38% of the Mexican population reports having seen armed convoys. Around 15% reports being extorted by the criminal groups. The same proportion reports having been extorted by the police. And help from criminals is around 12%. And then those show so the territorial contestation variable. I again don't have time, but we constructed. We know where each cartel operates in Mexico. We constructed this measure of cartel dominance, so we can know places where one cartel dominates versus places where there is contestation. So that's another of our dependent variables. And finally, these are the results. So I think it more or less supports what we are saying. So in contested areas, so where you have more cartels, you have significantly higher levels of extortion. And in terms of help by criminal organizations, we have more help in monopoly areas and also more help in areas of low violence. And then here quickly, which is the part of the corruption that I wanted to mention, we have very strong effects for PAN governments being engaged with significantly less extortion than PRI governments. And this is something that deserves more research, but we do find a very strong difference in the way the PAN and the PRI are engaging with criminal groups. And these controls for all sorts of indicators of the locality. So for example, PRI tends to win in poorer places, so we control for that. We control for whether the locality is rural or urban, and also we control for all sorts of individual level characteristics. So the conclusion here is that, about the cartels, it's interesting. I'm not going to go in detail, but we do find very strong evidence that the Sinaloa cartel engages more in help versus the Zetas, which are very, very violent, and also La Familia Michoacana, which at the moment, 1 year before the survey, the leader of La Familia Michoacana had been arrested, and the region was completely taken over by the Zetas and other cartels. So it was a region that was very highly contested. So the conclusion is that criminal extortion has increased significantly in Mexico as a result of, on the one hand, government policies that contributed to this metamorphosis of criminal groups through the leadership arrest and the increased multiplication of criminal groups, and then this new, sort of way in which criminal groups are capturing local government to perform their illegal operations with complete impunity. And this is a form of really worrisome form of mafia state that is really developing in Mexico. That has produced more violations of human rights, more violence and atrocities than the authoritarian regime of the last 70 years. I think that's a little longer. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, I'm mindful that I'm between you and lunch, so I'll try and be very quick. So my background is I study India, so everybody's qualified themselves. There are a lot of people this morning who qualified themselves by saying that they don't know much about Brazil and what's going on in Brazil. I'm going to follow with that caveat. I actually spend a lot of time in India, usually around December. For American academics, it's the best time, one of the best times to get out and see what's going on in the countries of interest. This time, I should say, December 2016, when I was in India, I would go to weddings and I would hear people telling me, I don't want to join the government, corruption is too entrenched. I would go and give talks and I would hear students saying, I don't want to go into government, corruption is too entrenched. I would meet people on the street and I would hear the same exact thing, the same line. And so I started to think a lot about it because this is something concerning to me. If only the bad people go into government, or if people go into government with a certain set of expectations, we can have some really bad consequences happening. I started to send them articles, so I started looking around, started to send people articles like these. Countries in other parts of the world where corruption is just as rampant, they seem to be actually doing something. At least in December, that's what it seemed like was what was going on. So we've got on this side, of course, Brazil. I know Dilma was, I just learned this last night, she wasn't impeached for corruption. She was impeached for technicality, but she was certainly weakened by corruption allegations. We've got Korea on the other side. And these two cases kept on fascinating me quite a bit, Brazil and Korea. So I would look at it, even after I got back from India in December. So this is sort of just the timeline. These two cases, there are a lot of similarities. So here you've got Samsung, which is one of the chaebols in Korea. Korea has a very large set of companies that sort of dominate their economy, founded in 1938. Petrobras founded around the same time. These are national champion companies. We've got a long period of mostly military government rule in both countries. Then with the third wave of democracy, both countries actually in 1988 passed new constitutions. Then we've got these sorts of things happening. 2014, 2016, we see similar kinds of things happen. This takes me to India. Now when I get back from India, I start to pay attention to what's going on. I keep following the news. I'm sending these articles to people. What ends up happening is Korea says, okay, we're done with it. Once Park leaves power, by about March, it's sort of over. So from November to March, that was pretty much the extent of going after the president. The president was impeached. Very quick process. Brazil, of course, investigations are continuing, right? So we've got these two cases, right? One where there's a systematic attempt to go after corruption, and one which seemed like a much more targeted attempt. You know, on the face of it, when I looked at this, I thought it was the same sort of dynamic happening. History would suggest that there was a similar sort of pattern going on, but it seems like there was actually a really different sort of thing. So this got me sort of head scratching, like some of you guys might be thinking of. So they're really different outcomes. So if we just run through it, we've got car wash, which is ongoing. A lot of people are getting in trouble. Samsung, this scandal was largely resolved. What actually happened here was a bunch of different chaebols were contributing to the president's slush fund, sort of. It was actually run by an advisor and some of her aides. A huge amount of money, about $70 million estimated, being channeled there. In Brazil, we've got many political factions facing charges. In South Korea, it seems like only Park and her immediate supporters were out of power. They were kicked out, they were put in jail. About 20-odd people from government. Rivals remained untouched. Of course, there was stuff to suggest that they also are involved in these kinds of activities. And in the private sector, we've got Brazil right now, where there's a lot of consequences, I would say, for these people. In Korea, the heir to the Samsung empire, he went to jail, and some of his lieutenants went to jail. But for the most part, most people in the private sector remained untouched, including the tribals who also apologized for contributing to these slush funds. So the leaders of these other companies also said, we've been giving money to the same places, and we're going to move on now, right? So that's sort of what the attitude was there. So what we see is systematic anti-corruption effort with Brazil and a very targeted anti-corruption effort in South Korea. So the question is, why is Brazil's anti-corruption effort systematic? And oppositely, why do we see a much more targeted effort in South Korea? So possible explanations, I think a lot of them came out in this morning as well as in Justice Barroso's talk. So we've got differences in the nature of corruption. Maybe there's something fundamentally different about what we see in Brazil versus South Korea. And I'm going to address this in a little bit. Maybe it's corruption is not a systematic problem in both ways. Maybe the scale is different. Maybe something like that is going on. Maybe there's some differences in civil society. A lot of people are saying that in Brazil, civil society has played some kind of a role. It's clear that it has. What was going on in Korea? I think that probably the most important thing is this differences in judiciary and senators. And this keeps on coming up as well today. So I'm just going to run through these very quickly. Hopefully, I don't keep you from lunch too long. So just to start, is corruption different? So this is Transparency International Corruption Perceptions Index. I actually inverted the ratio, so Brazil is on top, meaning it has more corruption officially. I think, if I recall, South Korea is ranked 79th and Brazil is, or South Korea is ranked 52nd and Brazil is 79th. So they're sort of close to each other. Of course, the grand corruption is what's a little bit more interesting. So we've got these national champions with similar sorts of histories in both countries. Grand corruption as opposed to petty corruption. Petty corruption is those on-the-street, day-to-day bribes. Grand corruption is this much more systematic stuff that I'm sort of concerning myself with here. These national champions, they survived through various political regimes. You know, if you did well in a military regime and you're able to sort of handle your business in a democratic regime as well, you're probably doing something there. You're also both of these companies, Samsung as well as Petrobras, highly reliant on a lot of supportive state interventions to protect them. There were a lot of important sorts of connections that were necessary for these businesses to work the way they did. In Korea, I mentioned that Samsung is there. This is percent of GDP. So if you're going to tell me that these companies don't really matter very much to the economy, Samsung is about 28% of Korean GDP. The entire economy in 2011. The top 5 tribals, I just saw a statistic in 2016, about 70% of the entire economy. So very, very entrenched in the economy. Petrobras is not to the same extent in Brazil, of course, but it's part of the story there. So is grand corruption different? Well, you could also tell me maybe the elites, the political elites in Korea, maybe they do keep some kind of an arm's length relationship. These are the previous presidents. This is Park. This is the person who was recently impeached. Her advisor and her aides were receiving this money from various tribals. Nearly every single president in South Korea has some kind of major anti-corruption charge that was levied against them. Only Park was impeached. A couple of them went to jail. One of them actually committed suicide. This one, when corruption charges came, or actually, he didn't commit suicide. Sorry, Roe committed suicide. Kim Dae-jung, he was implicated in the Cash for Summit scandal where $500 million were transferred to North Korea to arrange a summit. He actually won a Nobel Prize for this. The head of Hyundai, which is another tribal, he committed suicide in response to this. It turned out he had given $100 million to facilitate that. So there is lots of large-scale bribery happening here. This guy goes to jail, and I think this guy got in a little bit of trouble, committed suicide before it really got there. This is a really interesting case where this guy, he was involved in price fixing and got elected. And what ends up happening is, right as he gets elected, the prosecutors decide to drop all of their cases because it turns out the president actually controls a lot of these processes. And the Supreme Court backs off pretty quickly. And that's sort of part of the story that I'm going to tell you today about this institutional reform. So if we think about this, I think we can sort of eliminate this, differences in the nature of corruption. If anything, Korea might have a little bit more entrenched forms of corruption, but it's certainly grand corruption on this scale is fairly rampant in both places. If we think about differences in civil society, and here I'm giving you the really quick and dirty. This scandal, Park Samsung scandal, was initially uncovered by the press, so we had a very aggressive press. Of course, in Brazil, scandal was first detected by federal police. We actually had pretty good civil society mobilization in Korea. So 1 to 2 million protesters, they were coming out every weekend for 17 weeks. They actually were coming out to protest Park specifically, saying Park is corrupt. They weren't trying to push for an overall anti-corruption sort of movement. Of course, in India, we did have those kinds of movements about 5 years ago. Not much came of it. Nobody really went to jail or anything serious like that. So I think what we can say about civil society, and again, this is very hand-wavy, very cursory, it seems to support anti-corruption efforts, but it doesn't really, I think, explain the difference between targeted versus systematic attempts to go after corruption. So civil society plays some kind of role. Not sure exactly what, but it doesn't seem to really be a differentiator here. So in terms of judiciary's incentives, I just went through this very quickly. Some of these things that we're thinking about that we were talking about yesterday, merit exams, this is with the police. So actually in Korea, the police are directly responsive to the prosecutor's office. It's a very linear top-down sort of relationship. Police can't do their own kinds of investigating. They have to follow whatever the prosecutors tell them. So there is a merit exam, but the promotions are handled by the prosecutor's office. In Brazil, you've got your merit exam as well. Promotions, it seems to be apolitical at the top levels. Please tell me if I'm wrong, because I might be completely off on this. Top level director general is a president senate confirmation. These are typically career sorts of jobs. Not surprisingly, in Brazil, as I mentioned, we've got corruption detected by cable TV. It wasn't a corruption scandal outed by a police force or some kind of prosecutorial body that was trying to investigate this, as opposed to Brazil. Prosecutors in South Korea and Brazil, again, merit exam. We think merit exams are important. We're seeing in Korea and in Brazil we've got merit. But the promotion, here's where it gets political, right? So you've got the Ministry of Justice, which actually can do a lot of things and control prosecutors' careers quite a bit. Ministry of Justice is controlled mainly by the president. You've got your Brazilian system. I've labeled it apolitical. I'm sure there's a little bit more of a story behind that. Attorney General, again, President Senate confirmation. You can have your Attorney General replaced in Brazil. Here you've got prosecutors in Korea. They played a relatively reactive role. They only really acted once Park's party split in trying to go after Park or do things like that. In Brazil, of course, right now the prosecutors are racing against the police, trying to capture and uncover the next big scandals. So they're playing a much more active role. I won't spend much time on this, but again, lower courts, you've got merit exam. The people who are involved in hiring judges in Korea, it's the Supreme Court Chief Justice who ends up getting chosen typically by the president. And then you've got your Supreme Federal Court and Constitutional Court. You've got, in South Korea, it's mostly presidential control. And then in Brazil, you've got nominated by president, confirmed by Senate. In Korea, you've got a 6-year term, as opposed to a life appointment in Brazil. This 6-year term, the president's term is 5 years. So almost every single president gets to nominate a Supreme Court Chief Justice, which then affects the Constitutional Court and controls most of the Supreme Court. And I'll show you that in a minute. Park was the exception. She was that odd person after 30 years who didn't get to choose the Supreme Court Chief Justice. So this is the Korean court structure, just to shoot through it. Chief Justice appointed by President with consent of National Assembly, 6-year non-renewable term. All the justices are appointed by the Chief Justice. All inferior court judges appointed by Chief Justice. Chief Justice is a really important position in Korea, and it just so happens it's very closely controlled by the president. Then there's a separate constitutional court, which has final say over things like impeachment. 3 are directly appointed by the president, 3 appointed by the Chief Justice. Oftentimes that means that the president is getting at least 6 people on that constitutional court, and then 3 appointed by the National Assembly. That can really do you in if you're trying to have some kind of reform that checks the president. Usually the president gets 7 out of 9. They get one of the National Assembly votes as well. Park only had 3 out of 8 when it mattered. Actually, all of them voted against her. So by that point, she was sort of done. So a couple of conclusions, and this is, again, I'm thinking about some lessons for India here that we might be able to take on for ourselves. So India has endemic corruption. What should we do, right? We have grand corruption, we have petty corruption, and we have everything in between. I've been listening about how we don't throw out voters. In India, we've got 70% with criminal cases against them, including a lot of cases of corruption. We've got endemic corruption. What should we do? I think the first question is, should India really think about pursuing a systematic anti-corruption drive now, right? So in Brazil, a lot of the accomplishments that have happened were in spite of all of this happening, right? So all of this anti-corruption stuff. Brazil is, as you mentioned the other day, able to fight poverty, has had all kinds of achievements, presumably while this corruption is going on in the background. Korea, same sort of story, right? It's a developed, successful country. Their economy, yes, they had a short blip with Park out, but they quickly recovered. Now they're one of the fastest growing developed economies in the world again. It's an open question. I think corruption is very expensive. The articles that I put at the beginning also suggest, the headlines were saying, that these kinds of actions can destabilize democracies and potentially threaten some weak institutions, right? We haven't seen that in Brazil or Korea, of course, but for India, this is an open question. Some kind of systematic pursuit might be sort of dangerous for India. Maybe this is something that India should think about doing later. But if we take the idea that India should do it, maybe not now, the question is what is necessary? I think we have to see some kind of comprehensive judiciary reforms. Merit-based exams, as I think the Korea and Brazil case show, that alone won't do it. Maybe we'll attract some better people, but we need something else also. We have to think about the subsequent promotion systems and things like that. So it probably has to be something much more comprehensive than just a one-shot solution. Supportive civil society is beneficial, but not determinative. So we've had marches in India before. Brazil, Korea, we've got marches. Brazil seems to matter. These other 2 countries doesn't seem to matter to the same extent. Maybe civil society has to play a different role or something like that. Also this, I didn't really talk about this, but this lone reformer idea, it's unlikely to succeed. So there are always these, I'll tell you, Bollywood movies always have this star person who can, overthrow the system and change things. Even when you read the cases in Brazil, yes, there are some, lions of the system and heroes of the system, but there are a lot of them, and it's actually much more of an institutional response. It's not an individual fighting corruption alone. So, this is just sort of a last moment sort of thing before I end. I think it's worth asking whether Korea, with these targeted kinds of anti-corruption efforts, whether over time this can lead to some systematic anti-corruption. There's a little bit of literature here on India about how sometimes corrupt politicians try to target one another's forms of corruption. So if you're engaged in grand corruption and your opponent is engaged in petty corruption, you might push a lot of policies that stop petty corruption and vice versa. That might be one kind of sort of thing that might lead to this kind of change. But it's sort of a little bit mixed. Maybe this is the path. Thank you.
Right, Alberto to do, right, standing up here and discussing papers that you haven't read based on presentations that were all very, very interesting, that I liked a lot. So congratulations to the organization of the conference for putting these papers together. I think they dialogue well. I'm not going to make comments individually to you, but I'm just going to try to propose some themes to spur the debate, to motivate our debate here. Miriam and Nada have very similar papers. They're both concerned about how politicians avoid blame for getting involved in corruption scandals or being involved with corruption, and what conditions, therefore, the punishment politicians receive, and what are the institutions that impose punishment? If not the voters, who would it be? I think there's one aspect of this equation that I would like you to discuss, which you didn't in the presentations you made here, which has to do with campaign finance. We know, for instance, looking at the Brazilian case, that campaign finance is in the root of much of the corruption scandals that we've been discussing. Lava Jato, Mensalão, all of them are somewhat related to funding received during campaigns. And in a paper that I wrote with Marcos and Ivan Jucá, and we published last year, we show that a form in which politicians avoid blame during campaigns for being involved in scandals is spending more money in the campaign, advertising against, say, for instance, the accusations they received for being involved in these corruption scandals. So you avoid blame by spending more in campaigns. I don't know if that would fit into somewhat the Italian case or not, or if it doesn't, what would be other factors in addition, say, to partisanship that would mitigate, say, the effect of corruption that I think Miriam mentioned somewhat, that the trade-off here wouldn't be as relevant for voters. So if you could both, and my evidence comes from Brazil, Nada, so how would that filter into your discussion about how perceptions, about corruption or the source of information, how it matters on your emotions and preferences regarding politics? I understand you're not so much concerned about punishment, but much more about emotions and choices regarding politics. But I think to understand, as I said, corruption and corruption involvement and its effect, its electoral consequences, you must look into money and politics. And I think that that's somewhat missing from the two discussions we had, the first two papers. Beatriz paper also, and I'm going to push this debate into that direction as well, because when you think of the capture of the state by criminal organizations, which is, I think, a very important topic all across Latin America today, it also reverberates or reflects somewhat in how politics is being funded in Latin America, right? We have some cases, some examples, right, of illegal funding of campaigns, and there's increasing views, I guess, or perceptions that criminal organizations are funding politics more and more. Actually, if you think of the Brazilian case, restrictions maybe in legal donations, right, which is what we've basically done somewhat when we restrict donations to the public sector or to individuals, would that motivate, for instance, more funding from illegal organizations and therefore increase its capture, right, of the state? When we think of Latin American politics, and I think the research you're doing in Mexico really portrays this well, we're moving away from House of Cards into narcos, right? I mean, it's not anymore about that kind of contestation that we see in one series, but much more linked to what we see in Narcos. I saw an episode of Narcos about money laundering that, I mean, reminded me somewhat of the practices that Brazilian parties do in how they deal with unaccounted for campaign funding. So again, the role of money in Mexico and Mexican elections and how that facilitates the capture of the state, and then obviously hurting people in the end, right? And to this, I get to Dincha's presentation, because you were concerned in the end about the cost of systematic anti-corruption fight. What I'm talking about here is the cost of corruption to the political system somewhat, right? Because I'm focusing on campaign finance and how the state is captured by these actors. So wouldn't it be important to take into consideration in your discussion the effects that corruption have to the population, right? And then looking at the case of Mexico would be an excellent example of that. But you can also look at the case in Brazil, for instance, where people are dying in lines waiting for public hospitals, right? And actually the public prosecutor's office in Rio made a very, and I think the judiciary as well, made a very close link between the state of public hospitals in Brazil and Rio de Janeiro and people dying in line, and the amount of money that actually was stolen by former governor in Rio, and the amounts were similar. So again, would the perception of the cost of corruption be an important indicator affecting systematic and targeted actions towards against corruption. So that's what I had. Thank you so much for the great presentations.
Do you want to comment quickly? Questions? Please identify to whom you pose the question.
My question is to Nana. So I really like your work, and I think it's really important for us to understand, this trust in the judiciary playing a role. But I would like if you could comment more on your findings on the outsider, and how do you measure being an outsider, how credible they are as anti-corruption politicians, and how they are fully perceived, and if you could comment that also on the more educated side, like whether the voters who are more educated I think it was not clear from your presentation, how much this channel of trust in the judiciary increases the support for outside candidates, and how this is here for you.
Maybe we could just collect more, but maybe it would be faster
Perhaps.
to collect.
Let's collect all the questions, 3 minutes of questions, and then.
Okay. For Miriam, what's your interpretation of the mechanism that explains the punishment from 92 to 94? Is it a coordination issue where voters understand that others might be doing the same thing? Is it a higher dose of the informational treatment because the media is amplifying the information? And then with Nada, so I wonder if you have any thoughts on the possibility here that things we as analysts interpret as positive, which is the judiciary investigating and doing all these things and saying good things about the system, maybe interpreted exactly the opposite way by voters. I mean, it kind of takes the positive spin that we've been advancing and turns it on its head because it's showing how people support this topic.
Two questions for Miriam. One is, are there any other studies like this one in Italy? Because, we don't want to generalize from one case. And although I must say what you say sounds very convincing, but a lot of it kind of depends on the strength and nature and ideological polarization of the party system. And so this is really for everyone, and I think the whole conference. To the extent that, and I think this is the problem in the United States right now, and we're going to probably see it play out next week in Alabama, to the extent that party identification is extremely intense and very entrenched, then yeah, it's not going to matter. But to the extent that it's decomposing or becoming fluid or people are not very attached, then you might not need the parties to act. It might be more possible that the voters will act. So I would be cautious about these generalizations. I think a lot of this is probably pretty context and even historically contingent, but I'd like to know. And just briefly, Miriam, is it true that no one was jailed in Italy? I thought Bettino Craxi went to jail. Anyway.
He fled the country.
Oh. And that gets to my last point, 20 seconds. Increasingly, this is really internationalized. And I think we're seeing a lot of instances now, I know this is the case in a number of African countries, where people are not being prosecuted in their countries, they're being prosecuted abroad for money laundering and so on. And this is actually having an influence on political perceptions and developments in the home country. I think increasingly we should think about this in a globalized context.
So two questions. So one is for Miriam actually, which is about the credibility of the judges and the judicial system. So I remember you telling me the story of Falcone and Borsellino being received with carnations or flowers in Turin. So this role of kind of, because that's not about the media, it's something about like this collective imaginary of these heroes, the heroic part of fighting the powerful. So I wanted to ask you if that is really something that has to be there in the mix in some way, or it's just anecdotal. And to Nara, just a question about your control groups in the way you set up the experiments. It seems to me that you are triggering a series of sort of eliciting responses. Since you're at the pilot phase, I feel comfortable making the comment that it seems to me that you're eliciting a series of questions about the dignity of the person who's answering by, the control group doesn't tell them anything about what they know about politics. And then suddenly you kind of trigger, this idea, do you know that blah, 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 blah is going on? And that kind of, I think, to me, immediately calls into question, I have to come and tell you, of course I know Lavajat, of course I'm a responsible citizen, I'm a civic-minded person. So I just wonder a little bit about whether you can tweak a little bit your control groups to make sure that you don't have that going on.
Over there. Yeah, I wonder if any of the panelists might be willing to comment on the phenomenon we've seen in Central America, particularly, for example, Guatemala, where we have an anti-corruption unit under the authority of the United Nations, that it gave enough support to the Attorney General of the country to eventually investigate the president and vice president with their impeachment. That's had spillover effects next door in Honduras as well, where the public demanded something similar. They didn't get it exactly, and they have sort of like a compromise under the auspices of the OAS. But I wonder if you can comment about, what the value of that is, and ultimately, is that really a viable alternative? Carlos, then John.
Hi, Miriam. And have you been able to tease out, Miriam, the difference between the effect of the electoral rules and the scandals themselves? Because according to your data, it's very clear that under open list, proportional representation, and the money police, the punishment was higher, right? So the amount of corrupt politicians that have been refused to run again was smaller, right? So under a mixed member system in the second scandal, which was, at least internationally, less famous than the money police, I don't know about, internally in Italy, the extent to which it was. So my question for you is that, to what extent it would be the effect of a change in the electoral rules or the scandal itself, right? So, and another point is about campaign finance related to what Lucio raised it to you, because we do have a paper, and before the Judicial, and became a preeminent player in Brazil, right, Lucio? So we got all the corruption scandal that legislature got involved, and we found very similar results than you did regarding an indirect effect, but not from voters, but from campaign financiers. So, and business people refrain from donating to corrupt politicians to be afraid of being involved, to put their names on corrupt guys. So what do you think about that in Italy? So the market reacted negatively about this kind of thing. No, I don't want to give money to you anymore, given that you are, attainted or something like that.
This question for Miriam. Just a couple weeks ago, you gave a talk in the department that I really liked, in which you said that.
As opposed to this one? Is
I want you to kind of see how they fit together. So there was the argument was that in a bunch of developing countries, no one ever gets reelected. And this is a bad thing, and we need to find a way to convince them that reelection actually is possible, if you do good things. And so the problem to be solved was that reelection rates were too low. And then this is a setting where reelection rates are too high. You have pedophiles being reelected and so forth. And we need to find ways to get either the elites or the politicians or the voters to lower the reelection rates for people who've done bad things. And so, what is it just that one is a developing context and the other is a developed context? Is the intervening variable more about institutions? Just kind of how do I think about reelection rates, and what is it that you are saying about democracy and reelection rates? And
Questions closed. No answers. In 5 minutes times aggregate.
So I'm not sure I can effectively aggregate, so I'm going to have to select a couple of questions. Of course, I'm happy to talk about these issues over lunch. Let me begin with Jonathan's question. So what I think is not And what I think is that the creation of a political class is a function of the interaction between re-election rates and the political entry of certain types of people, public-spirited types versus rent seekers, we could call them. I think that in poor countries, people who enter politics are less public-spirited than in wealthy countries, and that interacts with institutions and with re-election rates and behavior by voters in different ways in those two settings. So I don't think that you really can study one thing, like just re-election rates in isolation, if you want to understand the full range of outcomes that we observe across countries of the world, and in particular if we want to understand how much corruption there is in different countries. So I'll leave it at that. That's not an answer, it's just telling you how I hope to answer the question. Let me answer Larry Diamond's question, which is, as others have stressed, voters typically do not punish corrupt politicians under any kind of electoral system. So there may be somewhat more punishment under some types of systems where it's easier to identify the corrupt politician, for instance, or where partisanship is more relaxed and more fluid, it's easier, but we really don't see voters being effective in punishing corrupt politicians as a regular matter in any setting of which I am aware. The difference between countries that have low corruption and countries that have high corruption is not that voters are more effective in punishing, it's that the bad guys either don't enter, or when they enter, they control themselves because there are other elites who are watching and monitoring what they do. So I do think that it's really much more a culture of elites that controls corruption. Not to say that democracy is not lurking in the background as a very important enabling condition that signals to elites that they have to behave a certain way. But the punishment is very subtle and long-term, I would say. I've used my...
Thank you.
I'm going to have to select questions to answer, and then I'm happy to talk about the other questions. So just answering Manuel's question on outsiders. So we are, in the context of the survey, we're just asking a question, that question that I explained. So the first answer option is, basically the question is, who do you think would do a better job running the country? And then the first option is a traditional politician from a traditional party. The second option is a reputable individual from outside of politics that will be willing to govern with traditional politicians. And the third option is a reputable politician from outside of politics that is going to combat traditional politicians. So that's how we are measuring. I'm happy to talk about how to measure it better and how to do things differently. And that the strong heterogeneous effects we find across levels of education is really interesting because it's consistent across all our outcome variables. So we always find that. We're still, we got the data for this survey a week ago, so we haven't even had time to think about it. But the idea is that maybe what's going on is that those are the people who are actually responding to our treatment, because maybe those are the ones who get it, or maybe those who care about those issues about impartiality and about the effectiveness of institutions. But we do find this consistent thing that the effect of the treatment is much larger among educated people. And maybe those are the ones who, are aware of it, and those who care about the judiciary. Maybe we don't find, for the second experiment, we don't find heterogeneous effects across trust in the judiciary. It's only the first experiment. So we're still thinking about what could be driving it. My impression is that it's basically the mechanism that connects people to the treatment. So basically, that's where the effect is flowing from. And Taylor, I completely agree with you. I think we do tend to interpret this judicial activism as something positive in general, and something that will, lead to good outcomes. And maybe in the long term, it's going to lead to good, maybe even in the short term. But what I'm calling attention to is that there might be other effects, side effects or spillover effects that could also be going on. So basically, even though we think it's important to punish corruption, it's important for the judiciary to step in and to be active. As I said, the reality for most people is that they're just learning really bad things about their system. So maybe the judiciary is crashing their hopes. And hopefully in a few years, we're going to be able to have a more definite answer to that.
I just got one question, so I'll be very quick. It was on the question of the costs and benefits of pursuing anti-corruption. I think that we've got a lot of rhetoric out there right now floating around that corruption in all forms, in all instances, is bad, and we need to try and fight it, and we need to reduce it. I don't want to champion corruption. That's the last thing I want to do, especially before lunch when you guys can throw stuff at me. But I think that it is worth asking, and we do see politicians actually oftentimes make these kinds of calculations, trying to weigh out, okay, if I go after corruption, say somebody within my own party is doing something, what consequences will that have for my state, for my party, for my standing? These are the kinds of equations that they oftentimes sort of play out. Citizens as well, they seem to be willing to tolerate, in certain instances, a certain level of corruption. One thing that I found going through this Korea stuff was this refrain, corrupt but competent. Korean citizens seems to be happy with some level of high-level corruption as long as everything else seems to be continuing. At least historically they were like that. So I think it's an open question. It's something we need to consider. I don't think there's an answer, one extreme or the other, which one is quote-unquote better. We're going for an all-out anti-corruption push. There's certainly big costs on both sides.
I want to comment on the CICIG in Guatemala. I think this is a fascinating example of how external actors can be brought in to really try to restrain corruption. And in that case, it really, it worked to the point that it brought a government back. So that we should be thinking more of those institutional solutions. I don't think that many countries are willing to accept this because obviously it limits their freedom. So other institutional possibilities we have, been studying that in Mexico. Mexico is a federal system as Brazil is, and so it really is very difficult because the reforms have to be at the state level. There is nothing, really very little that can be done just at the national level. No? So at the state level, we've seen cases where the business community is very harmed by these activities, and they actually decide to, do an entirely new police corporation, and that has worked. Obviously, not every state in Mexico has that type of business community, but we saw that happening in Monterrey. So when we were conducting some interviews there, and the local, this is the municipal level police corporation, the chief of the police his life had been threatened 12 times. So they have to rebuild the entire police department. I was doing interviews there. They told me, yeah, here is where they, sort of, with machine guns, no? And so to the point that before they receive their guns, there is a Virgin of Guadalupe. So they break to the Virgin and then they get the guns there. And the mayor there had been threatening her life twice. Twice they had attempted to kill her, but in that instance, the police seem to be working. No? And then we also have observed very different solutions in indigenous communities where there is a very dense organization of the community and they run their own police. That seems to work much better than when the police is run by the state. So again, it's going to have to be a very sort of different institutional solutions because of the nature of the federal state in Mexico. I wish we could have a Guatemala in Mexico. The Guatemala solution.
That's it. Thank you all. This court is adjourned.